I was adopted at 32. Finding my biological family destroyed everything I thought I knew about myself and then rebuilt it better. I want to start by telling you about the moment my entire life split in two, not a metaphor, an actual, precise, calendar-marked moment where the person I had been for 32 years ceased to exist, and someone newer, rower, and infinitely more confused stepped into his shoes. It was a Tuesday. I remember that specifically because I always hated Tuesdays. Mondays get all the reputation for being awful, but Mondays have energy, that grim, reluctant, coffee-fueled momentum of a new week grinding into motion. Tuesdays are just Mondays with the novelty worn off. Nothing interesting ever happens on a Tuesday. Except, of course, for the Tuesday that a FedEx envelope arrived at my apartment in Portland, Oregon, containing a single sheet of paper that informed me, in clean, professional legal font, that the man and woman I had called Mom and Dad for 32 years were not, in any biological sense, my parents. My name is Daniel Hargrove, or at least that's the name I've used my whole life. I was raised in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio, by Richard and Patricia Hargrove, a high school history teacher and a dental hygienist respectively. They were good people, genuinely good, the kind of parents who showed up to every school play, who argued about the thermostat instead of about each other, who drove a practical sedan and took one modest vacation every summer to a lake house in Michigan. I never wanted for anything important. I had a stable home, consistent meals, a bedroom with a window that faced the backyard maple tree I used to climb until I was 16 and too cool to climb trees anymore. I was not an unhappy child. I want to make that absolutely clear, because everything I'm about to tell you could be framed as a trauma narrative, and it isn't, or at least, it's not only that. It's more complicated. It's the story of what happens when a fundamentally okay life turns out to have been built on a foundation you never got to inspect. My parents told me I was adopted when I was 7. I remember that conversation, too, another one of those split-screen memories. We were sitting in the living room, Dad in his armchair, Mom on the couch next to me, the two of them doing that thing parents do where they're clearly performing calm. Dad said something like, "We need to tell you something special about how you came into our family." I remember thinking someone had bought me a dog. I was genuinely excited. When he explained what adoption meant, I nodded along and then asked if we could still get a dog. We did not get a dog. The thing about being told you're adopted at 7 is that you absorb it the way children absorb most information, incompletely, without context, and with a sort of elastic acceptance that adults can't replicate. It didn't feel like a tragedy. It felt like a fact, the same way it was a fact that our neighbor Mrs. Pelletier had a collection of ceramic owls or that I was allergic to penicillin. It was simply a feature of my world. I didn't think much about it through middle school or high school or college. People would occasionally ask, the way people do you ever wonder about your real parents? And I would say with complete honesty, not really, and mean it. My parents had told me what they knew, which wasn't much. I had been born in 1991 in a small town in western Pennsylvania. My biological mother had been young, unable to care for a child, and had worked through a private adoption agency. There was no medical history on file beyond the basics. There was no known father on the paperwork. The agency had long since closed. For most of my life, that was the entire biography of Daniel Hargrove, origin story. It felt sufficient. Then I turned 32, and Richard Hargrove, my father, the man who taught me how to ride a bike and helped me move into 4 different apartments, and sat with me through 2 bad breakups, had a heart attack. He survived, he's still alive, but there's something about watching a parent nearly die that reshacks the furniture of your mind. You start asking questions you've been comfortable not asking. One of those questions for me was simple and terrifying in equal measure. Do I have a genetic predisposition to heart disease? I didn't know. I had no family medical history. I was a blank page, and for the first time in 32 years, that blankness bothered me. So I did what everyone does in the modern era. I ordered a DNA kit. I want to be clear, I was not on a mission to find my biological parents. I was not embarking on some emotional odyssey of self-discovery. I was trying to figure out whether I needed to start taking a statin. That was it. That was the full scope of my ambition. I spit in a tube, mailed it off, and mostly forgot about it. The results came back 6 weeks later. Ethnicity breakdown, primarily British Isles and Northern European, with a significant Ashkenazi Jewish component that surprised me, since the Hargroves were lapsed Methodists from central Ohio. But what mattered more than the ethnicity was the DNA relatives tab, the list of people who shared enough genetic material with me to be considered family. I had a half-sister. Her name, according to her public profile on the platform, was Renata Sobel. She was 36 years old, and the platform estimated we shared roughly 25% of our DNA, consistent with a half-sibling relationship. Her profile picture showed a dark-haired woman laughing at something off camera, sitting at what looked like an outdoor cafe table. She had a small green leaf emoji next to her username, which apparently meant she was open to contact. I stared at that profile for 4 days before I messaged her. I drafted approximately 11 different versions of that message. The first one was 3 paragraphs long and explained my entire life story. I deleted it. The second one was 2 sentences and felt weirdly aggressive. I deleted that one too. The one I eventually sent was 3 sentences. Hi Renata, my name is Daniel. According to the DNA database, we may be half siblings. I was adopted and don't know much about my biological family. I hope this message isn't unwelcome. No pressure to respond. She replied in 4 hours. Daniel, I've been waiting for this message for 10 years. I need you to know that what I'm about to tell you is going to change things, and I'm sorry in advance that some of it is going to be hard, but I'm so glad you found me. Can we video call? I remember reading that message and feeling the first real flutter of something I can only describe as pre-grief. Not grief itself, but the shadow of it, the awareness that something was coming that I wouldn't be able to unfeel. But I said yes, because you can't say no to a half-sister who's been waiting 10 years. You just can't. We video called that same evening. She was exactly like her photo, dark hair, animated, prone to laughing at things that weren't quite funny yet but were on their way there. She was calling from what appeared to be a kitchen in Chicago, a pot of something simmering on the stove behind her. For the first few minutes, we just looked at each other with that specific speechlessness of genetic strangers meeting for the first time. At one point she said, "Your nose, that's the nose." And I said, "What nose?" And she said, "The Sobel nose, you'll understand soon." Her last name was Sobel because she'd taken her mother's name after her parents divorced when she was 12. Her mother was a woman named Irina Sobel, originally from Krakow, Poland, who had immigrated to the United States in the late 1980s. Her father was a man named Thomas Whitfield. Renata and Thomas had a complicated relationship, her word, and she'd mostly cut contact with him when she was in her mid-20s. Thomas Whitfield, she said carefully, watching my face, is your father too. I didn't say anything for a moment, then I said, okay. There's more, she said. How much more? A lot more, Daniel, she paused. Thomas has 3 other children besides you and me. You have 4 siblings total, but that's not the complicated part. What's the complicated part? She took a breath. On the stove behind her, whatever was simmering let out a small hiss. The complicated part, she said, is that Thomas Whitfield is not a name you want to Google on a work computer. I Googled him that night, on my personal laptop, alone in my apartment with a beer. I didn't drink past the first sip. Thomas Whitfield, 61 years old, former investment manager based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The first page of results was mostly court documents and local news articles. The second page was more of the same. The third page had a long-form investigative piece from a Pittsburgh alternative weekly, published in 2019, with a headline that used the words fraud, collapse, and victims in the same sentence. I'm going to be honest with you, the full scope of what Thomas Whitfield had done took me several days to piece together, and I'm still not sure I have the complete picture. But the outline is this. Thomas had spent roughly 15 years operating what amounted to a sophisticated financial fraud, targeting primarily Eastern European immigrant communities in Western Pennsylvania, Polish, Ukrainian, Czech. He would build trust within these communities through cultural familiarity, often leveraging the connections of his first wife, Irina, who was herself a Polish immigrant. He would offer investment opportunities with extraordinary promised returns. He would use early investors' money to pay earlier investors. He kept it running through an elaborate structure of shell companies and rotating account names. By the time it unraveled in 2017, over 260 individual investors had lost money. The total estimated losses were somewhere between $8 and $12 million, depending on which filing you looked at. He had been charged, he had plea bargained down. He had served 18 months in a minimum security facility and was released in 2020. As of the date of those articles, he was living in a suburb of Pittsburgh and, according to the most recent court document I could find, was technically compliant with his probation and a long-term repayment order that everyone quoted seemed to agree he would never come close to actually fulfilling. I sat with this information for a long time. There is a specific kind of discomfort in learning something terrible about someone you are biologically connected to but have never met. It's different from learning something terrible about a parent you've known all your life, because with that, at least, you have the counterweight of all the years of existing evidence, the birthday cakes, the arguments, the drives to the airport at 5 a.m. You have context. With a stranger, you have nothing to weigh it against. Thomas Whitfield was, to me, essentially a newspaper article. He was the Sobel nose and a federal plea agreement, and the reason Renata had warned me not to Google him at work. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the dark and thought about the 260 people who had handed their savings to a man whose DNA I shared. I thought about Irina, who had trusted him enough to marry him and who had, according to Renata, also lost her own savings in the collapse. I thought about my biological mother, whoever she was, and what her life must have looked like in 1991 when she'd been young enough and overwhelmed enough to put a baby up for adoption. In the morning, I called Renata back. "I read about him," I said. "I know," she said. "I figured you would." "Does he know about me?" There was a pause. "That," Renata said carefully, "is one of the things I need to tell you." She told me over the course of several calls that week, stories that came out in pieces, each one adding a new layer to a portrait I was still struggling to hold in my mind. Renata's parents had married in 1986, the year Irina immigrated. Renata was born in 1988. By 1989, the marriage was already bad. Thomas was erratic, secretive about money, gone for long stretches without plausible explanations. In 1990, Irina discovered that Thomas had been seeing another woman, a 20-year-old named Claire Ashworth, who worked at a restaurant he frequented. By the spring of 1991, Claire Ashworth was pregnant. "That's you," Renata said, not unkindly. "That's me," I confirmed. Claire Ashworth, from what Renata knew, had not been a bad person in a bad situation. She'd been young, in love with a man who turned out to be married, and faced with a pregnancy that Thomas had, according to Renata, who'd had this directly from her mother, who'd had it from a conversation she'd overheard in 1993, immediately pushed her to terminate. When Claire refused to terminate, Thomas had essentially walked away. He'd given her a sum of money. The amount Renata had heard was somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000, and told her it was for the situation. Claire had used it to cover her expenses through the pregnancy, and then, unable to support a child alone at 21, had placed me for adoption through a private agency. Thomas Whitfield had known I existed. He had chosen, at every point, to unknow me. "Does he know you found me?" I asked. "No," Renata said. "I haven't told him. I wasn't sure how you'd want to handle this, but I should tell you he reached out to me last year after he got out of prison. He's been trying to reconnect with his kids. He's got this whole redemption story. He's in therapy. He talks about accountability." Her tone was as neutral as a person can be while describing something they clearly find nauseating. "He's contacted my half-brother Marcus and my sister Deb too." "Marcus won't talk to him. Deb is sort of open to it. She's younger, she doesn't have the same memories." "And you?" "I met him for coffee once," Renata said. "In November, he cried. He told me he'd wasted his life and he wanted to make things right. He talked for 2 hours and apologized to me exactly once, sort of sideways, in a way that was really more of an explanation than an apology." She paused. "I haven't agreed to a second meeting." I spent a long time processing all of this. The shape of a man I'd never met, the woman I'd come from who had been 21 and alone and faced an impossible decision, the 260 people in Pittsburgh whose savings had evaporated. I thought about Richard Hargrove recovering from his heart attack in a Columbus hospital, and how he had, without any biological obligation, spent 32 years being a better father than the man whose DNA I carried had managed to be for any of his actual, known children. There was something clarifying about that, not comforting exactly, but clarifying. And then Renata said the thing that changed the shape of the whole story again. "Daniel," she said, "I looked into Claire Ashworth, your birth mother. I want you to know that I did this because I thought you might want to know, and if you don't, you can just stop me right now and we never have to talk about it." I did not stop her. "She's alive," Renata said. "She's 55 years old. She lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She's been married for 21 years. She has 2 daughters. And Daniel, she's been registered on the Adoption Reunion Registry since 2003. She registered the year you turned 12. She's been searchable for 20 years. She was waiting to see if you'd look." I didn't sleep again that night. This was becoming a pattern. Renata would tell me something. I would lie in the dark and stare at the ceiling, and my brain would run the information in loops until sometime around 4 am when I'd drift off for 2 or 3 hours and wake up feeling like I'd been processed through something industrial. My apartment, which I'd always thought of as a comfortable, neutral space, good light, decent furniture, books I actually meant to read, had started to feel slightly unreal, like a stage set for a life I was no longer fully certain was mine. 20 years, Claire Ashworth had registered on the Adoption Reunion Registry in 2003, when I was 12 years old and had been sitting there, findable for 2 entire decades. And I had never looked. I had never even thought to look. In my late teens, when a lot of adoptees go through a searching phase, I had genuinely not felt the pull. In my 20s, when I was building a career and moving cities, and living the kind of life that keeps you too busy to excavate your own foundations, it had never surfaced. And in my early 30s, the only thing that had finally moved me to spit in a tube was the fear that I might have inherited a bad heart, not from some deep hunger for origin, but from pure practical self-preservation. And the whole time she had been there, a checkbox on a database, a woman in Harrisburg with 2 daughters and 21 years of marriage, and a registration that said, in the most understated possible bureaucratic language, "If you look, you will find me." I thought about the 12-year-old version of myself, climbing the maple tree in the backyard in Columbus. What was I doing in 2003? I was in 7th grade. I had recently decided that skateboarding was my personality. I had a best friend named Kevin who I've since lost touch with, and a science teacher named Mr. Birch who made everything interesting by demonstrating experiments that were slightly too dangerous for a middle school classroom. I was fine. I was a fine, ordinary, maple tree climbing kid, and somewhere in Harrisburg, a woman who had been 21 and alone, and had made the hardest decision of her life had quietly, without any fanfare, opened a door and left it open. I thought about what that waiting must have felt like. Not the romantic version of waiting, not some cinematic vigil by a rain-streaked window, just the ordinary, low-grade, constant presence of a thing you can't resolve. Every year that passed without contact. Every birthday mine, though she wouldn't have known the exact date it was being celebrated, just that somewhere in the world a child who had come from her was turning another year older without her knowing what they looked like, or what they cared about, or whether they were happy. I found the registry myself the next morning. It took about 40 minutes of navigating state adoption records websites that appeared to have been designed in 2004 and never updated. But there she was. Claire Ashworth, maiden name. She'd registered under her birth name. The record confirmed a match on my birth date and county of birth. There was a contact email address. It was a Gmail account, which somehow made it feel more real than anything else. Not a legal entity or an intermediary service, just a personal email address, the kind you give to friends. I opened a compose window and sat with an empty message for a very long time. The message I eventually sent was longer than the one to Renata, but only slightly. I introduced myself. I told her I had only recently done a DNA test, that I had not been searching prior to that I had not known about the registry. I told her, and this felt important to say, that I had been adopted by good people, that I had had a good life, and that I was not reaching out from a place of pain or accusation. I told her I was reaching out because I now knew she'd been reachable for 20 years, and it seemed wrong not to say something. I told her she didn't owe me anything, that there was no pressure, that if she'd moved on and built a life and this email was a disruption she didn't need, I understood completely. Then I read it back, deleted the last 2 sentences because they felt like I was apologizing for existing, rewrote an ending that was just "I hope to hear from you," and pressed send. She replied in 11 minutes. 11 minutes. Later she told me she had a notification set up on her phone that every time a message came into that Gmail account, which she'd created specifically for this purpose and used for nothing else, she got an immediate alert. She had been carrying that notification in her pocket, essentially, for over a decade. Her message was 3 paragraphs. The first one said she had read my message 4 times. The second one said she had been hopping for this for 20 years and had also spent 20 years preparing herself for the possibility that it would never come, and that she didn't know right now which feeling was winning. The third paragraph said, "I want to tell you everything if you'll let me, but I want to do it right. Would you be willing to get on a call? Or if that's too much, we can do it by email. Whatever pace works for you." We got on a call 2 days later. I spent those 2 days in a state that I can only describe as suspended, not anxious exactly, but like every normal activity was happening at a slight remove, like I was performing my regular life from inside a glass box. I went to work, I answered emails, I cooked dinner twice. I watched a documentary about deep-sea fish that I have absolutely no memory of. And I thought about my biological mother, constantly in the background of everything, the way you think about a medical result you're waiting on, not obsessively, but permanently. Her voice, when I heard it for the first time, surprised me. I had unconsciously built some expectation of what she would sound like, something tentative, maybe, or overly formal. Instead, she sounded warm and a little gravelly and immediately, disarmingly real. She said, "Hi, Daniel," and there was so much weight in those 2 words, not performed emotion, just actual weight, that I had to take a breath before I could say hi back. "I'm not going to cry on this call," she announced, which made me laugh. "I cried for about 2 hours before the call, so I think I've handled the quota." "That seems efficient," I said. "I'm a very organized person," she said, and then she laughed too, and something in the conversation relaxed. Her name was Claire Renner now. She'd taken her husband's name when she married in 2004. Her husband was a man named Paul who worked in civil engineering. They had 2 daughters, Abby, who was 18 and had just started college at Penn State, and Sophia, who was 15 and apparently going through a phase involving exclusively black clothing and excellent taste in music. Claire had spent most of her career as a social worker specializing in family services, which she told me with a small, ironic laugh, which is either poetic or the least subtle form of processing I can imagine. She had been in therapy, on and off, for most of her adult life. She was 55 years old, and she sounded like someone who had thought carefully about almost everything. She told me about 1991 slowly, as if she was unpacking something she'd kept stored for a long time, and wanted to make sure she handled it carefully. She had been 21. She had met Thomas Whitfield through a mutual friend. He was 27, charming in the way she now recognized as practiced, attentive in the way she now recognized as strategic. She had not known he was married. She had found out she was pregnant in March of 1991, and she had told Thomas, and Thomas had, in the span of a single conversation, become a person she no longer recognized. He had been clinical, businesslike. He had produced the money quickly, too quickly, which she'd understood later meant he'd done this before, or at minimum had prepared for this possibility. When she'd refused to do what he wanted with the money, he had told her she was making a mistake and left. I was alone, she said, without self-pity. My parents were, it's complicated. My mother was supportive in the limited way she was capable of. My father was not in the picture. I had one close friend who drove me to prenatal appointments. I worked at a grocery store until I was 7 months pregnant, and then I was too tired. I used the money Thomas gave me to cover the gap because I wasn't proud, I just needed to eat. And when you were born. She paused. When you were born, I held you for about 45 minutes. The nurse was very kind. She took photos. I still have them. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say into that. I want you to know it was not an easy decision, Claire said. I know that probably sounds like something everyone says, but I want you to know specifically, it was not that I didn't want you. It was that I was 21 and I had nothing, and the one person who should have been there had given me an envelope of cash and disappeared. I believed, very genuinely, that whatever I could give you was not enough, and that somewhere there was a family that could give you more. They were good people, I said. My parents, they were really good people. I'm glad, she said quietly. I have thought about that constantly for 32 years, whether you were okay, whether you were loved. I said, I was really well loved. There was a long pause that was not uncomfortable. Through the phone I could hear something in the background, a television, maybe, or a radio. Can I ask you something? I said. Yes, anything. Did you know about the registry when you registered? Like, did someone tell you, or did you find it yourself? I found it, she said. A client of mine, this was in 2002, she was an adoptee, and she was looking for her biological parents. I helped her navigate the process. And then I went home and I found the registry and I registered my information, and then I sat in my kitchen and cried until Paul made me eat something. She paused. Paul knew about you before we got married. I told him everything on our 3rd date. He said, and I have loved him for this ever since, he said, if he ever finds you, I want to meet him. That was his entire response. Not a single complicated question. Just, I want to meet him. I didn't know what to do with that. I filed it somewhere warm. We talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes that first call. We didn't solve anything, and we didn't need to. We traded information the way you do when you're beginning something carefully, with pauses, watching each other for signs of how much weight the conversation could hold. I told her about my career. I was a software developer at a mid-size company, nothing dramatic, and about Portland, and about the 2 relationships I'd had that had lasted long enough to matter, and both ended without a clear villain. She told me about her daughters, and about Harrisburg, and about a garden she'd been growing in the backyard for the last 15 years that had started as 3 tomato plants, and was now, in her words, a full-scale agricultural project that my husband tolerates with remarkable grace. By the time we hung up, it was past midnight Portland time. I sat in my kitchen in the dark with the phone still in my hand, and I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I thought about calling my mom, Patricia, in Columbus, just to hear her voice. Not because anything was wrong, just because she was still my mom and she would still pick up on the first ring and she would still call me Danny in a way that no other human being on earth was allowed to. I called her, she picked up on the 2nd ring. She said, Danny, it's past midnight. Are you okay? I'm okay, I said. I just wanted to talk for a second. And she said, okay, honey, in the voice she'd been using since I was 7 years old and didn't know what adoption meant and was hopping for a dog. And we talked for 30 minutes about nothing in particular, my dad's recovery, a neighbor's new fence, a show she'd been watching. And when I hung up, I felt something I can only describe as the simultaneous presence of 2 truths. that Claire Renner in Harrisburg had held me for 45 minutes in 1991 and spent 32 years hopping I was okay, and that Patricia Hargrove in Columbus would pick up the phone at midnight without a second's hesitation and call me by the name I'd always had. Both of those things were real. Neither of them cancelled the other out. I was just beginning to understand that the story I was living in was big enough to hold both of them, and the rest of what was coming. Because I still hadn't thought about Thomas Whitfield. Not really, not fully. And Thomas Whitfield had apparently been trying to reconnect with his children, and Renata had told me he didn't know I existed. Which meant that somewhere in a suburb of Pittsburgh, the man who had handed my mother an envelope of cash and walked away from a pregnancy he'd caused was working on his redemption arc, and he had no idea that one of the consequences of his life was sitting in an apartment in Portland, putting the pieces of himself back together, one phone call at a time. I thought about whether I wanted to change that. I thought about it for a long time. Here is part 3 of 4. Let me tell you about the week I spent not making a decision about Thomas Whitfield, which was itself a kind of decision. I had his name, I had his address, or at least enough information to find it with minimal effort. I had a half-sister who had met him for coffee and come away unconvinced. I had a half-brother named Marcus who refused contact entirely, and a half-sister named Deb who was cautiously open, and somewhere beyond them, I was told, there was a fifth sibling, a son named Greg from a third relationship Thomas had had in the mid-90s, who had grown up not knowing Thomas at all, which made Greg and me something like parallel versions of the same story, separated by 5 years and a few hundred miles. I found out about Greg through Renata, who had found him the same way she'd found me, through the DNA database, through patient cross-referencing, through the particular skill set of someone who had spent years quietly assembling the full picture of a family that had been deliberately scattered. Renata, I was learning, was extraordinary. She had a methodical, almost forensic approach to information that coexisted with a genuine emotional warmth. She could spend 40 minutes walking me through a family tree she'd reconstructed from public records, and then pivot immediately to asking whether I'd eaten dinner and meaning it. She was 36 and worked as a data analyst for a healthcare company in Chicago and had been, she told me, processing the Thomas situation since she was approximately 8 years old and had first understood that her father was not who he presented himself to be. The thing about Thomas, she said one evening, during one of the calls that had by now become a near-daily ritual, is that he's not a monster in the cartoonish sense. He's more exhausting than that. He's a person who has a very sophisticated internal system for making himself the protagonist of every story, including stories in which he caused significant harm. He's not incapable of remorse. I genuinely think in the moment when he cried in front of me at that coffee shop, he was feeling something real. But it was real the way a weather system is real. It moves through. And then it's gone, and the landscape it crossed is still dealing with the damage, and the weather has already moved on to the next thing. I thought about that description for days afterward. It seemed useful not just for Thomas, but as a general taxonomy, people who experience emotion as something that happens to them and then passes, rather than as something that accumulates into responsibility. The question of whether to contact him was genuinely difficult, and I want to be honest about why. The easy narrative would be that I was afraid of rejection, afraid of confrontation, afraid of what his reaction might do to whatever equilibrium I was currently managing to hold. And that was part of it. But the more complicated part was this: I wasn't sure what I wanted from it. With Claire, the goal had been simple in the best possible way. She had loved me and lost me and spent 20 years hopping I was findable. Contact with her was, from the very first message, a form of completion, 2 people closing a loop that had been open for 3 decades. It felt like something meant to happen. Thomas was different. Thomas had not registered on any reunion database. Thomas had not left a door open. Thomas had handed money to a woman and walked away and built a life, multiple overlapping lives, actually, that did not include any accounting for me. Whatever he was doing now, whatever therapy-inflected redemption story he was assembling in his suburb of Pittsburgh, I was not a chapter in it. He didn't know the chapter existed. So the question was not just whether I wanted to contact him. It was whether I wanted to inform him that I existed, and what I expected to receive in return for that information, and whether what I expected was something he was actually capable of giving. And underneath all of that was a quieter, more uncomfortable question, whether some part of me wanted to contact him not for anything as clean as closure, but simply to disrupt. To walk into his reconstruction of himself and say, here is a thing you did that you have never had to account for, to be the evidence he'd managed to avoid. I didn't feel good about that impulse, but I also didn't think pretending it wasn't there was useful. I talked to Claire about it, which felt strange at first, asking my biological mother for perspective on my biological father, the man who had given her an envelope of cash and disappeared. But Claire had a quality I had come to rely on quickly, which was that she had apparently done enough therapy and enough honest self-reckoning to be able to discuss Thomas Whitfield without any of the distortions that bitterness can create. She had opinions about him. They were not kind opinions, but they were clear ones, and clarity is more useful than kindness in most navigational situations. "You don't owe him the knowledge that you exist," she said. "I want to start there. That's not a thing you owe him. If you contact him, it should be because it serves something for you, not because it completes some moral accounting on his side." "What if I don't know what it would serve?" I said. "Then you probably need more time," she said, "which is fine. This has been going on for 32 years. Another few months won't change the underlying geometry." I appreciated that, the underlying geometry, the shape of the situation that existed regardless of what any of us decided to do about it. I did not contact Thomas, not yet. Instead, I did something that in retrospect was both the most practical and the most emotionally consequential step I took in that whole period. I booked a flight to Harrisburg. Claire had suggested it carefully, in that way she had of raising significant things lightly, as if she was placing them on a table and stepping back to let me decide whether to pick them up. She had said something like, "If you ever wanted to meet in person, no pressure, completely your timeline, Paul and I have a guest room, and the garden is at its best in October." It was September when she said it. I booked the flight 3 days later. I told my parents, Richard and Patricia, before I went. This felt important. Not as a permission-seeking exercise, because I was 32 years old and this was my life. But because they had been honest with me for 32 years and I owed them the same. I called them together on speaker, which was how they always took calls, and I told them what had happened since the DNA test, the DNA match Renata, the information about Thomas and Claire. There was a silence when I finished that I let breathe rather than filling. Then Patricia said, "Danny, oh honey." And Richard, who was still in cardiac recovery and who taught history and who had been a quiet, steady presence in my life for 3 decades, said, "Are you okay? That's a lot to have landed on you in a short amount of time." "I'm okay," I said. "I think I'm okay. I wanted you to know because you've never hidden anything from me and it didn't feel right to hide this." We don't feel threatened by this," Patricia said, and I could hear her choosing the words carefully. "I want you to know that. This is your story and you should be able to follow it wherever it goes." "I know," I said. "The woman, Claire," Richard said. "She sounds like she's handled all of this with a lot of integrity." "She has," I said. "She really has." "Then I'm glad you found each other," he said, simply, without performance. I got off the phone and sat for a while with the considerable fortune of having been raised by people like that. People who could hear, "I found my biological mother," and respond with, "I'm glad you found each other," rather than with the 1,000 forms of wounded ego that response could have taken. I flew into Harrisburg on a Friday afternoon in early October. Claire had offered to pick me up from the airport, and I had accepted, partly for the practical convenience and partly because I wanted the first face-to-face meeting to happen in a transitional space, a place of arrival, where a certain degree of unreality was expected and allowed. I spotted her before she spotted me. She was standing near the exit, holding a piece of paper with my name on it, which she absolutely did not need to do since we had exchanged photos and would obviously recognize each other, but which I found immensely endearing. She was shorter than I expected. Something about a phone camera flattens people. She was wearing a grey coat and her dark hair had some silver in it, and she was scanning the crowd with the slightly anxious alertness of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time, and is now, with it imminent, nervous about what it will feel like to have the waiting end. She saw me, and the thing that happened in her face in that moment was something I won't describe in too much detail, because some things deserve the privacy of not being fully translated into words. What I will say is that it was not dramatic. There was no slow-motion movie moment. Her face changed in the way faces change when something that has been braced for a long time finally releases, like a hand that's been clenched slowly opening. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I said. We stood there for a second, and then she said, "Is this weird if I," and gestured vaguely, and I said no, and she hugged me. It lasted about 5 seconds, and it was awkward in the way hugs between people who don't yet know each other's rhythms are always awkward, and it was also one of the most real things that had happened to me in months. In the car, driving toward her house, we talked about the flight and the weather and a road construction project that had apparently been a source of local grievance for 2 years, and it was the most normal conversation I can imagine, and I was grateful for every second of it. The normalcy felt like a gift. It felt like she was saying, "We do not have to perform the magnitude of this." We can just talk about the construction on Route 30 and let everything else exist beneath that conversation like a river under ice, real and moving, and not needing to be looked at directly yet. Paul was at the house when we arrived. He was a tall, solidly built man with reading glasses pushed up on his head and the easy manner of someone who has decided in advance to like you. He shook my hand and said, "Great to meet you," with complete sincerity, and immediately asked if I was hungry, which I was, and that was essentially how I met the man who had married my biological mother, over a plate of pasta he'd made because Claire had told him I'd had a long travel day, and he decided that pasta was the correct response to a long travel day. Later I would learn that Paul's response to most problems was food, and I found this very relatable. Abby, the 18-year-old, was away at Penn State and would not have been home in any case, but she had apparently known about this visit and had texted Claire that morning. "Tell Daniel I said hi and that I hope it goes well." Sophia, the 15-year-old, was home. She appeared briefly in the kitchen doorway, assessed me with the frank, evaluative gaze of a teenager encountering a new adult in her space, said "Hi Daniel" in a tone that suggested she was reserving judgment but was not hostile, and disappeared. 10 minutes later she reappeared and asked me what music I listened to, which was apparently her primary metric for human worth. I mentioned a few bands. She considered this, nodded slowly in a way that implied I had passed some threshold, and sat down at the kitchen table with her phone, half in and half out of the conversation for the rest of the evening, which felt completely natural. After dinner, after Sophia had gone upstairs and Paul had tactfully excused himself to watch something in the living room, Claire and I sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea and talked for a long time. Not about the big things, we'd been saving those for in person, but when the moment came, they arrived gradually, the way big things actually do, rather than all at once. She told me about the 45 minutes in the hospital. She took out her phone and showed me the photos, 3 of them, taken on a film camera by a nurse who had clearly understood the weight of what she was doing. I was a very new baby in them, the kind of newborn that has not yet resolved into a recognizable face, eyes sealed, hands curled. Claire was 21 and exhausted, and looking at me with an expression that needed no interpretation. I looked at those photos for a long time. "You look terrified," I said finally. "I was," she said. "I was also," she stopped. "I was also so grateful you existed. That sounds complicated given the circumstances, but it was true. You were real and you were here and I had done that. And then I had to make a decision that I made because I loved you, which is also something that sounds like a thing people say but was for me, literally the operating logic." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "I have never fully made peace with it. I don't think I'm supposed to. But I've made a kind of coexistence with it. Does that make sense?" "It makes a lot of sense," I said. We sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. Outside, it was October in Pennsylvania, which meant it was cold and clear, and through the window I could see the garden she described, the 15-year agricultural project, now put to bed for the winter, a series of raised beds and trellises that in the low light looked like a complicated and beloved structure, the kind of thing you build slowly over years without a plan, each addition made because it felt right at the time. "I want to ask you something," I said. "Yes." "Did you ever think about not registering, not leaving a way to be found, just closing the door and moving on fully?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "When Abby was born, actually, I thought, this is my family, this is my life, I've built something real, and maybe the kindest thing for everyone is to let that door close naturally." She paused. "But I couldn't, not because I thought you'd definitely look. I genuinely didn't know if you would, but because if you ever did look, I needed you to be able to find me. I needed that to be true regardless of whether it ever became relevant." I thought about what it means to hold a door open for 20 years for someone who might never come through it. What that costs, carried quietly, while you build a garden and raise 2 daughters and go to work and live a whole life. "Thank you for that," I said, "for leaving it open." "Thank you for eventually looking," she said. I stayed for 3 days. On the second day, Paul took me out to see a civil engineering project he was working on nearby, a bridge rehabilitation that he was clearly passionate about, and talked to me for 90 minutes about load distribution and concrete fatigue and material stress tolerance, and I understood maybe 40% of it and found all of it oddly comforting. On the third day, Claire took me to the garden in the morning light and walked me through every section of it, what she'd planted, what had worked, what had failed spectacularly, the bed she'd started the year Abby was born, the roses she'd put in the year her mother died, the section along the far fence that she was still in negotiation with and had not yet figured out. I flew home on a Sunday. At the airport, we hugged again, and this one was less awkward than the first. We had 3 days of accumulated ordinary time in it now, a shape that fit better than the one at arrivals. On the plane somewhere over Ohio, I thought about Thomas Whitfield in his suburb of Pittsburgh, working on his redemption, not knowing I was in the airspace above him. I thought about all 5 of his children, scattered across the geography of his choices. I thought about Renata, methodical and warm, assembling the family map. I thought about Marcus, who refused contact, and Deb, who was cautiously open, and Greg, who had also grown up without him, and all the different ways you can respond to being the consequence of someone else's failure to show up. And I thought about what I actually wanted, not what was just, not what was owed, what I, Daniel Hargrove, 32 years old, wanted from the remaining piece of this story. I still didn't have a clean answer, but somewhere between 30,000 feet and the runway at PDX, I started to understand the shape of it. I contacted Thomas Whitfield on a Wednesday morning in November, 6 weeks after I got back from Harrisburg. I want to tell you exactly why I did it, because the reason matters more than the outcome, and I think if I'd had the wrong reason, the outcome would have been different, worse probably, for everyone involved, including me. I did not do it for justice. I had thought about that framing and rejected it, because justice implies a system and a verdict and some form of rebalancing that I was not in a position to deliver, and he was not in a position to receive in any meaningful way. The financial victims in Pittsburgh had a legal process, however inadequate, that was at least nominally addressing what he'd done to them. What he'd done to me was different, not worse, not better, just different. He had not known me. He had chosen not to know me. You cannot deliver a verdict on an absence. I did not do it to disrupt his redemption. I had thought about that too in the less flattering hours of the night, and I recognized it as the impulse it was, the desire to be the complicating fact, the proof that his accounting was incomplete. That impulse was real, and I did not shame myself for having it, but I also did not want it to be the engine of a significant decision. Decisions made from that place tend to cost the person making them more than the person they're aimed at. I did it because Renata asked me to, and because the reason she asked me was one I couldn't argue with. She had been doing what she always did, quietly, methodically assembling information, and she had found something. Thomas, in the course of his post-prison redemption effort, had hired an estate attorney and was in the process of revising his will. She didn't know the specific details, but she knew enough from a conversation with Deb, who had cautiously resumed contact with him, that the will as it currently stood divided his remaining assets among his 4 known children, Renata, Marcus, Deb, and Greg. Whatever those assets were, and given his conviction and the repayment orders, they were likely modest. I was not in them, because as far as Thomas Whitfield's legal and financial existence was concerned, I did not exist. I'm not telling you this about the money, Renata said carefully. I want to be clear about that. I couldn't care less about whatever's in his will. But it's a legal document that describes his family, and his family includes you, and I think you should have the opportunity to decide whether you want to be counted or not. That should be your decision, not a default. I sat with that for a few days. She was right. Not about the will. I genuinely did not care about the will, but about the principle underneath it. For 32 years I had been an undocumented consequence of Thomas Whitfield's life, a decision he'd made and paid for and moved on from. The question of whether to tell him I existed was, at its core, a question of whether I wanted to remain undocumented. Whether I was willing to be known, to the one remaining person in this story who didn't know me, as a person who was real. I decided I was. The message I sent him was the shortest one I'd written through this entire process. 4 sentences. I told him my name. I told him I was born in March of 1991 in Western Pennsylvania. I told him I had recently connected with Renata, and she had been generous enough to share information about him. I told him I had no expectations and no demands, and that I simply thought he should know I existed, and that if he wanted to respond, I was reachable, and if he didn't, I understood completely and wished him well. I pressed send and closed my laptop, and went for a walk that lasted about 2 hours, through the grey November streets of Portland, past the coffee shops and the bookstores and the small parks where people walked dogs with an admirable indifference to the weather. I did not check my phone. I bought a sandwich I didn't finish. I watched the Willamette River for a while from a bridge, the water moving south with that flat, pewter-colored conviction that rivers have, completely unconcerned with the things happening above them. When I got home, there was a reply. I need to be honest about what I hoped his reply would be, because I think being honest about that is the only way to fairly describe what it actually was. What I hoped for, what I had not admitted to myself I was hoping for until I saw there was a reply waiting, was something that matched the emotional weight of what I had sent. Not a confession, not an apology, not a scene from a movie about redemption. Just recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has been confronted with a consequence of their choices and chooses, this time, not to look away from it. What I got was more complicated than that, which is to say, it was realistic. His message was long, several paragraphs. The opening acknowledged who I was. He did not express doubt or ask for verification, which told me something about his capacity for self-awareness, or at least for facing things he'd arranged not to face. He said he had known about the pregnancy. He said he had told himself, over the years, various things about that Claire had been capable and resourceful, and would manage, that he'd provided financial support, which was what he could offer at the time, that a child placed for adoption was a child who would find a good family and have a better life than he could have provided given his circumstances. He laid these out not as excuses exactly, but as the actual contents of his self-justification, and I found that more valuable than a polished apology would have been. He was showing me the real architecture of how he had lived with it, rather than the renovated facade he might have presented if he'd been trying to impress me. He said he had spent the years since prison in what he called a sustained attempt to understand the damage I caused to people who trusted me. He said it had taken him longer to extend that accounting to his personal life than to his financial crimes, partly because the financial crimes had a court date and a legal structure that forced the reckoning, while the personal ones existed only in the space between him and the people he'd affected, where there was no judge, no deadline, no mandatory process. He said he was in therapy. He said he met with Renata when she agreed to it, that Marcus wouldn't speak to him, that he understood why, that he was trying to hold space for that without using it as an excuse to stop trying. And then he said something I have thought about many times since. He said, "I don't know what I can offer you. I am 61 years old and I have less to give than I once had in every way that matters. I spent the resources of my life on things that did not deserve them. What I have left is the ability to be honest with you, to not ask you for anything, and to tell you directly, I am sorry that you grew up without knowing where you came from. That is something I caused. I cannot undo it. I can only tell you that I am aware of it, and that I am glad you exist, and that you do not have to do anything with that information." I read it 3 times. I let it be what it was, rather than what I'd hoped for or feared. It was not a full accounting. It was not the kind of apology that resolves things, but it was honest in a way that felt effortful, like someone doing the difficult work of saying a true thing rather than an impressive one. I wrote back. I kept it short. I told him I had received his message and appreciated its honesty. I told him I did not need anything from him and was not looking for a relationship, but that I was glad to have made contact and that the door was open if he ever wanted to use it. I told him I had found my biological mother and that she was well and had built a good life, and that I thought he should know that. He replied to that one in a single line, "Thank you for telling me. I have thought about her often." I did not write back to that. Some sentences are complete as they are. It has been 8 months since that exchange. Let me tell you where things stand, because stories like this are never fully resolved, they're just updated. Claire and I talk every week, sometimes more. She has become, in the clearest possible sense, a person I cannot imagine not having in my life, not a replacement for anything, not a correction of anything, just an addition, an expansion. We have developed the easy rhythms of people who genuinely like each other. We recommend books back and forth. We argue mildly about movies. She sends me photos of the garden at various stages of its seasonal cycle. I send her photos of things I find in Portland that remind me of things she said. Her daughter Sophia, after several months of reserved evaluation, has decided I am acceptable and occasionally texts me music recommendations with no context, which I have learned is her highest form of affection. Abby, home from Penn State for spring break, video called me with Claire one evening, and she is funny and sharp and has strong opinions about architecture, and I like her enormously. Paul continues to be exactly who he was the first night I met him, which is to say solid and warm and unfussy, the kind of person who makes you feel like the world has load-bearing structures you can rely on. Renata came to Portland in February, ostensibly for a work conference, but really, we both knew, because we had been doing this intimacy entirely over video calls, and it was time to exist in the same physical space. We spent a weekend doing exactly nothing remarkable: coffee shops, a bookstore, a walk along the waterfront in the grey February rain, dinner at a place I liked. We talked about the family, about Thomas, about her work, about a person she'd been seeing who she was cautiously optimistic about. At one point, sitting across from her at a small table with our coffees, she looked at me and said, "You have the nose, by the way, I told you." And she was right, we have the same nose. The Sobel nose, which apparently comes from Irina's side, a grandmother I had not known existed 6 months ago and have now, through Renata's meticulous documentation, a small archive of photographs of. A woman who immigrated from Krakow in 1988 with a suitcase and a husband who would eventually take everything she'd trusted him with, and who had raised Renata alone after the divorce, and who died in 2018, 2 years before I knew she'd existed. I grieve her in a specific and manageable way. the way you grieve someone you never knew but belonged to. Marcus I have not met. He knows I exist, Renata told him with my permission. He sent me a brief message through her saying he wished me well and hoped my experience with Thomas had been okay. That was the entirety of the communication, and I respect it completely. Some people have reasons for their distance that don't require explanation. Deb sent me a longer message, warm, slightly tentative, offering to get on a call whenever I was ready. We haven't done it yet, but we will. These things have their own timing. Greg, the fifth sibling, the other undocumented consequence, I spoke to in March. He is 27 and lives in Philadelphia and is currently in graduate school studying environmental science and has, in his own words, approximately zero desire to engage with Thomas but a lot of desire to have siblings, which I found both funny and very relatable. We have tentative plans to meet in person this summer. Renata is talking about organizing something, all 5 of us, or however many of us are willing, at some neutral location. It has not been planned yet, it may not happen, but the fact that it is a thing being discussed rather than an impossible abstraction represents a kind of progress that I find quietly remarkable. Richard is recovering well. His cardiac team has him on a modified diet and a regular walking program that he follows with the diligence of a man who has been told, in very clear terms, what the alternative is. He has asked me once, gently, how things are going with the other family, not with any edge in it, just with genuine curiosity and the slightly formal delicacy of a man navigating terrain he's not sure of the rules for. I told him things were going well. He nodded and said he was glad. Patricia has been more openly curious. She asked Claire's name, asked what she was like, asked whether I thought she and Claire might ever, and here she paused for a long time choosing the right word, connect. I told her I didn't know, that someday it might be a thing that happened or it might not, and that either way was okay. Patricia said, I just want you to know I'd be open to it, if it ever felt right. And I believed her because Patricia Hargrove has, for 32 years, consistently been exactly the person she says she is. I want to end by telling you what this experience changed, because I started this story by saying my life split in 2 on a Tuesday in Portland, and I think you deserve to know what happened to those 2 halves. Here is what I thought I knew about myself before the DNA test. I was a man who had been adopted, who was comfortable with that fact, who did not feel the absence of his biological origins in any way that disrupted his life. I thought this was a form of wholeness, that I had taken a potentially complicated thing and made my peace with it so thoroughly that it no longer occupied space in me. I thought the absence of the question meant the absence of the wound. What I understand now is that it wasn't wholeness. It was a very well-maintained numbness. Not a damaging numbness, not the kind that comes from suppression or denial, more like the natural anesthesia that forms around something you have no way of addressing. You cannot grieve an origin story you have no access to, so you don't. You build around it. You become someone who is fine, which I was, and functional, which I was, and genuinely happy in many ways, which I also was. But there was a shape in me that I had never fully occupied, because I didn't know it was there. The shape had a name, it turned out. Several names. Claire, who had held me for 45 minutes in 1991 and waited 20 years to be found. Renata, with her methodical care and her sobble nose. Irina, the grandmother I would never meet but could now picture standing in a kitchen in Krakow in 1988, preparing to cross an ocean. A lineage, a context, a set of biological facts that are not a replacement for anything I already had, but are a foundation I hadn't known was missing. I am not more myself than I was before. I am not less. I am more fully assembled. There is a difference between those things, and it matters. The 2 halves of my life, the before and the after of that Tuesday in Portland, have not fused into one continuous narrative. They coexist, overlapping, each informing the other in ways I am still discovering. The Hargrove story is still mine. The Columbus suburb, the maple tree, the parents who showed up for every school play, the man who taught me to ride a bike and answered the phone at midnight without complaint. All of that is fully mine, and nothing about what I found diminishes it in any direction. And the other story is mine too now. The one that begins in a hospital room in western Pennsylvania in March of 1991, with a 21-year-old woman and 45 minutes, and a decision made from love in the absence of good options. The one that includes a man in Pittsburgh who caused real damage to real people, and is living, imperfectly and belatedly, with the weight of that. The one that includes 4 siblings scattered by the geography of one person's failures, finding each other slowly, through databases and careful messages and weekends in rainy cities, assembling something that might eventually be called a family if you're willing to use the word generously. I am willing to use it generously. I have learned in the past 8 months that family is not a structure you're born into so much as a practice you choose to maintain. My parents in Columbus have practiced it for 32 years without biological obligation, purely on the basis of showing up. Claire practiced it for 20 years in the form of a door left open. Renata practices it by building maps that turn scattered people into a knowable constellation. I am learning to practice it too, in small, concrete ways: the weekly calls, the book recommendations, the photos of a garden in October, in the willingness to be found and to keep finding. That is what the story rebuilt, not a new self in place of the old one, just the full version of the one that was always there, finally given all the rooms it needed to breathe in.